Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, great. So it's a real honor to be back. It's a funny word. It's not an A1, but on a digital framework at my alma mater. And thank you, Ludwig, for inviting me to give this talk today. The title of our lecture today is Ways of Rebelling. And it's going to be the stories of quite a young practice. And really, we're still students, and we're trying to navigate our world, or navigate away in this world that is a little bit precarious at the moment, but very exciting for us. And when I started preparing this lecture, there's also a design of its own sort, and it started in the same place that every design does, with a blank page and a lot of anxiety around what to put onto the page. And I was thinking about, how do I deliver this lecture or talk around our thought process? So the blank page is apt. And what I did is, sometimes when I'm trying to understand an idea, I start to doodle. It can be doodles about anything. But today I doodled what I call the face of space, which is a portrait of our projects that we've done over the last 3 years in our practice, to try and make sense of all of them and all the lessons that we've learned, and all of the things that we've done, and some of the failures that we've had, and the ultimate successes that come from a process of continuous failing and trying again. So this is the face of space. And you can see that if the deeper you look, the more things you'll find, which is like making buildings or designing anything. And what one realizes when you look at this sort of composition is there's a lot that's in it, but it's not really just architecture that makes up all of this. It's a lot of people and a lot of hands and a lot of thinking and a lot of learning and a lot of involvement and investment in a project, not just from us, but from everybody that's in it. So here we have a page of the people that have worked in our design practice, and some continue to work in our design practice over the last 3 years. And this is a page of all the people who've been involved in actually making these projects come to life, or who have brought ideas to the table. Some of the names are clients. A lot of the names are people who have been builders on our sites. And we've learned something from everyone. And when you have this as a knowledge base, your opportunity for growth is infinite. So just to give you a scale comparison to who it was. And this is our team at the moment, our design team. And you can see we're all quite dapper in the office. And these are the people in our construction team who have been with us the longest, who kind of run things on site for us, guys who have taught us things, people who we've taught, and they actually make the buildings happen. And that's what I'm going to speak about mostly today, are the hands that make the visions come to life. So without these people here who influence these people here, you don't really get a lot of anything done. And over the last 3.5 years, these are some of the projects that we've completed or come up with. And it started in 2015 with the top little block, which was the thesis that I did at WITS. And it was, I think, the first real learning that I started to do in terms of who builds buildings, who makes buildings, how can a building be more than just a building, but that it can influence people around it, it can change and adapt, it can grow and it can listen. And we've had this process of doing things from very small interventions like our fabrication with Rebel Atelier, of light fittings, to big projects, bigger infrastructural projects like the work that we did at the country club, or really small things like an outdoor shower in the most pristine and perfect place in the world. And all these things sort of influence us on a daily basis as to how we look at architecture and what we do with architecture and the meaning that it has, not just for us, but for its own life. I'd like to start the base of this talk with a precedent study, which is something that we're very accustomed to doing as students. And not so long ago, I too was a student sitting in the place where you are now, trying to figure out this world of architecture and what it means to me. And I'm going to show you a building called the NITEROI Museum, the NITEROI Museum of Contemporary Art, which is in NITEROI, Brazil. And it was designed by Oscar Niemeyer and completed in 1996, sort of to the, I would want to say, tail end of his career, but I don't think he stopped until he died a few years ago. And it's this lasting piece of modernism, but it taught me several lessons in the way that I looked at it. So the lessons that I took away were embracing hands and feelings. And this is the building. Often when this building is portrayed, it's portrayed as a pristine white box and this sort of spaceship hovering above the sea. And in those portrayals, it looks contextual, like a willful form-finding exercise by an architect. But when you go to this building, you'll notice two things. Is when you're actually in the space, is how the parallel line of the mountain is caught in the building, and this view is framed continuously from the exterior, where you actually see that it kind of fits into its space. But the other thing that you notice is how rugged it actually is in real life. There's been no cladding put onto this building, and you see that the circular form of it, or the spherical form of semi-spherical form of it, is actually made up of flat planes that taper. And in this instance, the architect didn't try to hide any of it. All the ways of construction in the building and the mark making by hand is in the building. Whether it's the exposed structure that you see on the left picture and how it joins in and how rough it is without any idea of cladding, but how perfect it is in a sense. And the rough shutter work that gives shadows and character to the form of these big circular columns that hold it up. But also the way on the staircase which it's detailed, and how you can read the shutter that was put underneath it, and the hands that put the shutter up, and the refinement of each sliver of timber that went into creating this cascading underside of a staircase, and how that would have been stripped away by hands to expose this finished product. And all they've done is painted it white, but you can see all of the details. And it's something that's not often talked about in architecture when you look at pristine photographs that have been taken by professionals of a building. The grit and the imperfection, the beauty of the imperfection is often left out of that. But it's something that you experience as a human when you go into this space and look at it. And you can see the white also reflects the skylight and the light that surrounds it. And the simplicity of the structure has a poetry about space and about light and about texture, just through exposing its honest quality of this building. And the big thing as you come up the sort of like flowing ramp is that you're primed to enjoy a space. And when you come into the space, this is what you see, is a permanent exhibition of hammocks. And there's something so peaceful about being in this building, because I took a nap in the hammock in the photograph for about an hour, because it makes you want to linger longer in the building. The architecture becomes the backdrop to your experience, and it allows you to have a human interaction with the space. It doesn't dictate to you what should be done. It doesn't try to overemphasize its importance, but rather it allows you the feeling of to have your own feeling of being in that space. And the handmade quality of the building creates a humanness around that feeling. And it's something that in our practice, we've tried to always bear in mind when we design. And that you realize that buildings are only alive when they're experienced. And no matter how expensive or how shiny a building may be, without a humanness to it, that building doesn't have any meaning. So I'd like to take you through a few projects that we've done. I've cut it down to 3. And the first, and then 3 lessons. So 3 projects with 3 lessons. The first lesson in rebelling is to rage against the machine, as we like to call it in our office, which is to constantly question the status quo and expand what we understand as the role of the architect from sitting and drawing and thinking and coming up with designs to really embracing buildings and construction in a tactile way. And in doing so, embrace the hands that make. So the first project that we look at is called Raw House. And the idea was to build a house of raw materials, which is sort of obvious when you think about it, is that everything is a raw material. But to understand the craft and to go back to the notion of the root word of architecture, which is archi and tect, in short. But archi means one who commands or is a master of, and tect or tectonics, also the root word of tectonics, is of construction or the way something touches the ground. And in essence, a builder, so a master builder. And this project that we did is called Raw House, because we tried to take raw materials without necessarily just using a system or finding a product from a spec book, but really understanding what each element, steel, concrete, timber, brick, can do and can mean when you work with it in poetic ways. And the second thing around raging against the machine or the system was to shift the hierarchy of site. Often architects sit above site and they do drawings and they hand it over to a contractor. We built this building as a collective and we were on site learning through construction and constructing it ourselves. But also to redefine in a more political way the meaning of a worker. In South Africa, you have labor and people who kind of build your buildings, but there isn't a notion around, or there isn't a clear notion around what that worker means and how much respect one has to have for this person who puts a building together. So we worked on everything from the design to the construction and the fabrication and the art pieces. And overall, we tried to use empathy for the building, for the client, for the builders as our organizing principle in this design. And what we tried to do is work with the truth to materiality. So our palette, which you see at the top, is timber, concrete, water, nature and trees, steel, brick, and raw and light that we worked with as a theme. And in our drawings, you can see how each of those elements kind of comes down and descends upon the ground into something that composes one picture. So this was the first piece of shattered concrete that I've ever made in my life. And I learned this from a man who is a master of shatters and an artist really in his own right when it comes to concrete form making. And the simplicity, often you look at a shatter or you look at a concrete wall and it's a concrete wall, but there's so many things that you can do. And even in these shatters, we had burnt one side and left it, we had burnt it and brushed it, we had left one side as plain wood, we'd left one side with wax to see what kind of finish we get. And the textures that come out of this material, this fluid, almost water-like material that's molded then into something hard and strong, and how it takes the form of even the finest detail in a shatter. And this was the first chapter that we worked with to try and figure out what kind of feeling we wanted to put into this building. And here you see some of the process around how we started to change things and how this building grew. And in the second image on the top, you see the builders that were working for us. We had put up a render and some drawings on site on the board. And as soon as we put it up, they all kind of scurried to it and looked at it on their way out. And essentially had a meeting where the more experienced builders explained to the younger builders how this building was going to be put together, because they could see it in their minds and now they had an image of it. And it was really to start informing a dialogue between those who are constructing things with us on site in a way that allows us to bridge a barrier of communication and to really grow the people around the project. That as we learn from the project, everyone learns from the project. And there's just so many stories in this kind of house that mean a lot more to us than just a residential dwelling. And here you see in the first image, there is a man inside the frame of the window that we had cast. And we did this in a single pour, so we didn't get any joints, which was very stressful because it was about 8 meters from the top of this wall to the foundation. He's the master, Barry, who taught me everything that I know about how to make a timber shutter, what to do, what not to do. And it's quite unforgiving because once you pour the concrete into it, you don't really know what you're going to get. And if you strip the shutter, you could have a terrible finish and a terrible wall without knowing it, or you could have something beautiful. And luckily, we got something beautiful in the product at the end. But here you see this, I love this image because there's a frame that supports this window with these pipes that go through, which we use to vibrate the concrete through the shutter. And we had no idea what was going on when I was at the top of the shutter underneath this window, and we were just hoping and praying that it didn't honeycomb and that it didn't sort of stop somewhere and that there was an air pocket. But his experience in shouting at us as we kind of did it on site was the reason why it came out okay. But it's also this thing of supporting the opening, this wet material that's molded and then becomes strong, and then you take out the support and you're left with this seamless, beautiful window. And these are some images of the building that we had put together. So you can see the timber, the polished concrete on the driveway, this rim flow fountain that comes into the pool as you enter it, all cast in concrete. And it's quite unforgiving because you couldn't make a mistake in something like this, and we'd never done it before. And here we learned about sort of sealing products and how to seal concrete. And in a project later, we grow knowledge even further as to how to do it. But what you can see is that everything is quite raw. It's raw timber. That's not kind of, that is what it is. And the concrete that goes straight over the edge of the pool with no coping or anything around it is really about how we learn from the craftsmen around us and then detail and design into that craft. And then at the bottom, you have these laser cut screens, which was a cheeky thing that we did in the design, or when the idea was that this house is in Sandton in a sort of gated area, and well, not a gated area, in an estate. And we wanted to bring back the city into this kind of space. So we did these laser cut artworks, which actually took longer to draw than the entire building and every sort of construction detail that we put together to bring this notion of the Johannesburg and the city back into a space which traditionally ignores it at this point. And here we look at this picture, which is quite a beautiful picture that was taken by a friend of ours. And that showcases the building and all the raw materials and the garden and the light and these things. And what I'd like to talk about here is the process of failure. And we failed at a lot of things here. If you look at this pond wall, the shutter that we put up first didn't really work, and then we had to demolish part of that wall and reshutter it and put it back. we were always behind schedule. The project was completed in about 3 months, and on Christmas Eve, we got the pool pump to start working. So we really cut it quite fine for our client. But there are lots of things that we learned through failure. You know, the shiny blacks, the shiny steel that we had on the balustrade had to go because the sunlight reflected so heavily on it that it created too much glare. So then we had to coat it black. And there are all these little things that you learn, and often you think that one's design has to be finished or fully resolved before it goes into construction, but actually the construction process is as much a part of design as the sketch design process itself. And here you can see kind of how it all comes together. But the process of trying and failing and testing, if one does it right, can lead to something that's very successful at the end. And we still have a good relationship with our clients, and they're happy. So I think fundamentally successful. Next lesson that I'd like to talk about is to question establishment. And there's a project that probably at this point our flagship project that we've completed in our office has a lot of underlying darkness in a way, but darkness because we're questioning it and because we chose not to ignore the things that are difficult. But what our lessons from here are to de-romanticize tradition. Often we have a nostalgia for the past, and people talk about things that were done a certain way in a certain time, and they're quite nostalgic about it without looking at what we call understanding the honest origins and where things come from. And architecture can often represent just the positive thing without truly looking at the holistic view of what happened in that time, and to take those two things and consciously transition into the future. So this is a clip from the Face of Spaces, and this is our country club project that we recently completed at the Johannesburg Country Club in Auckland Park. I'd like to start this part with 2 quotes, which I'll read out for those of you who might be struggling to see it. And both of these quotes are from The Wretched of the Earth by Frans Fanon. The first quote reads, "The settler makes history and is conscious of making it. And because he constantly refers to the history of his mother country, he clearly indicates that he himself is the extension of that mother country. Thus, the history which he writes is not the history of the country which he plunders, but the history of his own nation in regard to all that he skims off, all that she violates and starves." And the second quote reads, "Everything can be explained to the people on the single condition that you want them to understand." And in this project, there lies a tension for us between the 2 quotes, because the tension is that the people referred to in the second quote are also the settler in this project. And our question was, how do we start to elegantly disrupt heritage while conforming to certain rules of heritage and certain symbols of heritage within this colonial space that we worked in? And where do we place ourselves in this as young architects who don't share the same sentiment of the settler and its history and don't understand that world, because that's not the world where we come from? Especially when we're looking at Johannesburg and its colonized histories. It's got a deep and rich layered history in Johannesburg of making, of architecture, of history, of who writes it. And working in the space of opulence and privilege, we started to ask what the question of what heritage means in this kind of post-colonial space, which is starting to talk about inclusion and questioning ideas of privilege. So this was the palette that we started with. And often when one is trying to question a heritage, you think about how this, or how to break this facade, or destroy the heritage and leave it behind. And that's sort of the idea of conquest, where one ideology needs to supersede the ideology that precedes it, or to supersede the ideology that comes before it. And on this building, what we started to do is look very carefully at the things that we loved about this old colonial building. And at the back is an Edwardian building, which was opened in 1906 as the main club. And later on in the 60s, there was this Art Deco edition that was put onto the front of this club. And we thought, well, in the 60s, putting an Art Deco edition onto the front of an Edwardian building was probably in its own right quite a wild idea. So what we thought was, why don't we make a building that does the same thing by adding another wild idea, but instead of just putting a facade on it, we decided to, sorry, I think I lost screen share there.
Yeah, sorry, Vedhant. Someone else hijacked your lecture. At the moment.
That's fine.
Okay, just try again.
Okay, are we back online?
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. But we looked at this as a layer of how do we add a piece of to this conversation of heritage and of meaning to a space of privilege that hasn't, I think, in a space that doesn't really need to question itself, because it's isolated in a small utopian island in a way. And I really like this image because it's got the SABC and Centec in the background, like the city that hounds this idea of the utopia. And its rolling lawns and its pristine gardens and its perfect space. And we needed to sell this idea to the same people who are custodians of this colonial historical story. But we also wanted to question that space and to push it into the future in a way that was elegant, but also that adds to it without having to mimic what heritage is or what heritage was there, to make it disappear into what was old and almost tie it back into something that felt like it was always there in a way that just mimics the old. We wanted to put something new, and to put something that was of our time and of our generation of architects, but also to kind of keep the conversation between the two going. And the drawing that we did was, and we did lots of hyperreal renders and animations and all sorts of things, but the drawing that really sold it to the conservative people who needed to like our building at the beginning was this drawing, which is nostalgic, and it looks like it could have been drawn sort of 40 years ago and no one would know better, but with the idea of the thing that we were going to put there. And it prompted a lot of argument and a lot of debate around whether this was appropriate or not. And we kept trying to figure out how to do it. And you'll see later what our theory was that if we play with old details and the handmade again, that we could create something timeless that echoed the past, but was obviously pushing into the future. And these were some of the other drawings that we did of it. So you can see we rendered the front view in a more hyperreal way. And this is also part of our, I don't go too much into this in our lecture today, but part of our office is to master technology in a way. So we deal with different kinds of software. We work in parametric design, in 3D modeling, also hand-drawn drawings. And somewhere in the middle, we find between the traditional and the new progressive techniques of representation of architecture, we find our own sort of values in this process. And this was the construction process that we underwent. So in this project, we were a more traditional architect, except that we were there every day to see what was going on, because we were also quite uncertain whether this floating fabric roof that we had designed was going to fit and was going to work and was going to stand up. But we had an excellent team of fabricators and a great engineer, and who kind of guided us along the way, but who we also guided to get the shape of the roof that you see now. We built one-to-one paper templates with our fabricators, even though we had modeled everything in computer, to explain to them how we needed to build it and how it needed to be cut. And we had laser cut drawings, but those didn't work, and then we had to actually cut them by hand, like a drawing, once we had made this paper template. But there are a few things in these slides that I'd like to chat about. In the first image, it's the idea of breaking heritage and what it means. And in a cheeky way, it was quite a happy time for us, because we demolished what used to be the old cards room, which was a very drab area with card tables in it. And we turned that into a kitchen, like a living, pumping machine part of an establishment which usually hides its services. We brought it to the front and made it aesthetic, and it's the best view you can ever get if you're making a pizza now. The other is that our lessons from the first project around shuttering allowed us to do something much more complicated and much more sophisticated than what we'd done before. But because we had cut our teeth, so to speak, in the first time. So we did these curved or these tapering columns that hold each end of the structure, so that you essentially pin it from wanting to kind of unpack itself like a concertina on each side. And we did a rim flow pond again, but this time we didn't use any sealants on the concrete. What we did is we put Penetron into the concrete, and as a result, the raw material, the wet material, was the final finish without any post-construction treatment in it, and it works. And it was something that we had to learn about because of what we had done before. So you can see there's this idea for us of constant growth and learning and trying and testing and failing and figuring it out as we go. And then we have this sort of ship-like structure that perches itself on the top of these columns and creates an open floor plan for a restaurant to spill out into the patio. But it's in these images that I thought the building was the most beautiful, because you can see its bones and the grit behind the construction, and how it all fits and works and breathes together as like one pumping organism. And it was one of the most joyful and stressful and anxiety-working projects I've ever done. And the moment that I realized that the building was going to work was here, on this day, where this drone shot was taken by friends of ours from Counterspace, Sarah and Sumaya. They came and visited and took a drone out to shoot this building for us in its skeleton stage. And for the first time, you realize that something's going to work is quite a relieving thing on site, because there's so many things that are waiting for you to fail. And we had 7,000 members who needed to comment on this building, and we had, as you can imagine, some rough interactions with people who didn't like it and who called it a carbuncle, and questioned our integrity behind design. And you kind of have to have a thick skin and listen to it, but also trust that you've thought about all the things that they're asking you about too. And I suppose in that way is that if you don't think there's a chance that you can't do it, then maybe it's not worth doing. And it's this idea that the uncertainty actually is so much more rewarding once you see it in its flesh and you feel that it works. And here I'll show you two of my favorite images from this process. The one is this is what we call a moonbeam on the left. which has all the services, and this pristine white beam that comes in to the building later is actually made of raw steel and has this like machine, almost infrastructure-like quality to it on the inside. And the second is this veil of scaffolding when we were putting this building up, and then when we removed it, and there was a kind of horizontal veil of the building that was left behind. And this is the comparative building that we left behind for the project at the end. And you can see it's a sort of floating roof that hovers above the patio and shades you in summer, but allows sunlight in winter, made of so many different people and so many different components and so many different thoughts to create this one succinct piece of architecture. And here is a picture of what I call the feeling. So going back to NITEROI, the idea of the feeling and how people inhabit it, and how from the outside it looks quite big from a human scale, but from the inside this undulating roof actually just settles things down. And the purity of the detail that makes things uncluttered, that makes people feel calm. And the best comment I got in this building was a woman came up to me and said, I doubted this at the beginning, but then I came and had lunch here one day, and then I stayed the whole afternoon, and then I had supper, and it made me want to linger longer, and I really didn't want to leave. The next and final part of this lecture, I'm going to have to run through this a little bit quickly, is our last idea of rebelling, which is empowering through equity. Learning to let go as a designer, creating agency and ownership amongst the most vulnerable, and self-sustaining systems. And the project that I'd like to talk about is our smallest project, which we took the longest to do. It took about 2.5 years to get from the time someone asked us to do this project to the time we completed it. And we said yes to this project, but didn't quite know. And it's a soup kitchen that we had been asked to do in Kanana Park by someone I'd met at the Josie Book Fair, who was a community health worker, and said, I really want to build a soup kitchen by my house because there's school kids who go to school and they don't have food. And I want to feed them before they go to school and when they come back. So we said yes. I had no idea how to do it. We said yes. And over time, this project unpacked so many layers of meaning for us, but also for all the people and all the hands that were involved in making it. And we didn't, in our design that we didn't end up getting built. What we did instead was allow someone else to design this. And the people who designed it were our third-year students at UJ in 2018. And we went through a rigorous process in their construction class, of figuring out how to do it. Sorry, Ludwig?
No, it's someone who hasn't unmuted, so we'll sort it out.
That's fine. Okay, cool. Was our third-year class at UJ who did a design and build idea on this. And what happened was we ended up guiding them with this, and their lecturers, Jason Frankel and Deborah Kirkman, and the support of Denver Hendricks and Alex Opper, that we ended up having to find funding for this, get funding for this, lose the funding for it because the funders pulled out, go into another process of funding, and get these students who had never built anything before to do a project that was going to mean a lot to a space that really needed this building. And these drawings are not drawings that we did, but someone that you guys are a peer with, Ruvimbo, as a student. And these are the kinds of drawings that were generated. And we had to let go and not try to put our template on it or try to kind of force an idea of design or of thinking, of representation, and allow the process to organically create as much value for everybody involved as possible. And at the end, we ended up building the soup kitchen, which we then, and the woman in the picture on the right Sibongile is the real hero of this, because she's the person who asked for it and gave up of her land for it and was involved throughout the process of a painstaking 2.5 years to realize this idea, and that she now has ownership of this, and she started a non-profit organization called Helping Hands through this process, because she wants to do more projects like this and for Kanana Park in the community. And this one small project, which took very long to build and had many, many mistakes and failures and retries and restarting in it, fundamentally now feeds 250 people a day. And I like this project in comparison to the restaurant at the country club, because that also feeds about 250 people a day. But that's a big infrastructure, and this one's small, yet the impact of this one is so much greater than an elite space to have lunch. And we like to grapple with this tension of these things that we do, because we find meaning in them. And this project and the process of this project has prompted us to go into this architectural world of complexity that we see in the world now, especially now with the sort of shifting paradigms of how we design and how we can get on site and how we engage with people. That's come up in the last 6 months for all of us. But it allows us to truly start questioning how things are done and what kind of value one can add. And are the boundaries of architecture as fixed as we thought they were as a profession, or can we question those and move them on to greater spaces of bigger value for the world? And in doing so, we've now been inspired over the last year of thinking to start an NPO that works with this. And we've had some experience in working with government and in education and schools and clinics. And we've seen a lot of the failures in the governance of that. So we've decided to start an NPO called Rebel Sechaba, which Sechaba translates to community or nation, but a sense of togetherness. And in this idea, we want to do more projects like the soup kitchen, but on larger scales where it creates equity for the people who need it most, for the communities themselves. And it doesn't just superimpose a facility or an infrastructure on them, but aims to truly engage with the people who are going to use the building and to have a real sensitivity and empathy for those who are going to use the building. And it's not just about a form finding or an architectural mark making, but rather an involved project that allows for the most optimal use to come out of these ideas. And these are some of the ideas that we've come up with. We've done an open source housing app for self-built housing. We've looked at gender sensitive spaces in schools. And this is where we think the future of the Rebel group is going. Thank you.
Thanks, Dante. That was fantastic. Excuse me. That was really good.
Thank you.
Maybe just as an observation and introducing it to a slightly wider audience, I think the level of critical self-observation and ability to unpack an approach towards the work that you do and your team speaks of maturity way beyond your age.
Thank you.
I think also the focus on the collective, I think, is guiding principles of work, and also speaks to lifelong learning. It emphasizes the aspects of making, the assembly, the materials, and not only that, but also the people that do it. And I think it is highly commendable. That we always forget so easily that those that are involved in the making are on the waste, on the background, and are not celebrated. I think that is something that students and professionals alike should actually participate in more, and increasingly so. Also, your questioning speaks of a lifelong ability to, or a willingness for lifelong learning, which again I think is an inspiration. Thank you for that. I'm going to open it up a bit for queries. As in the previous one, slightly unruly sort of scenario with about 240 odd people in it, and not all being able to necessarily ask questions. So it's actually more open to the students, and so I'm awaiting some queries.
Okay.
Sure. If anyone wants to ask a question, I just open your mic and maybe give it a go.
Well, maybe while people are percolating about things to ask, as like a sort of closing remark built on the things that you've said now, Ludwig, is that the sort of the purpose around Rebel-Base is for collaborations, and as students or anybody else who's in this lecture, is that we're completely open to the idea of collaborating with people on projects that we don't know anything about even, or ideas or think tanks that challenge the current face of the world and the built environment into something empathetic and inclusive and honest. So if people do have ideas, then we're the place you can come to talk about them.
Sure. Is there anyone with a question? It seems like everyone's dumbstruck.
I don't think
I have.
Oh,
I have a question.
Yeah, please go.
Thanks, Saskia. On the house that you did, where you were basically experimenting with the timber shutters, how do you navigate the outcomes in terms of the possible imperfection, and I guess that is the purpose, but against mistakes that might happen and be seen against what the client feels or wants, just that room of uncertainty? How do you navigate all of that with a client?
So you don't tell them that you're going to make mistakes. Is the first thing. But I think it's a friend of mine put up a quote the other day, which I'm going to sort of paraphrase a little bit. But it's the idea of around the novice and the master. And the idea of mastering something is that you fail within a paradigm, or so not a paradigm, but you fail within a set of constraints. So you predict the outcomes that could happen before they happen. As a result, you'll also think of the solutions that you can make, because if you put in something willfully without thinking about it too much, then you do have a sort of an area where you can fail, and then it can be a big failure. But when we talk about failing, it means that we talk about not being scared to try something and learn from that thing. But it also has a level of having control elements as such to make sure that even if you do fail, that you have a backup plan. So we kind of have a plan Z on everything we do in a way. But it's about training. It's about having tried something before and trying something new. But having tried it before, which is why in this bit, in that house, we built that first little shutter where we tested the finish and we tested different things out and tested the strength of the concrete we wanted to use and the type of it and the admixtures. And then once we tested that, we sort of knew what we needed to do for the big stuff too. So baby steps, I suppose, is you fail multiple times on a micro level so that you can ultimately reach a macro success.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thanks.
Saskia, I think there was an answer. Question from your side?
No question from my side. I was just gonna speak in case anybody else wasn't. It was purely for awkward purposes, not for questions.
Very,
Sorry.
Thank you. Anyone else? So, no,
There was a hand up or something in the chat earlier. So
I think that was me. I just want to say, like, I really enjoy, like, it's not a question, it's just me trying, saying what I took from your lecture. I really enjoyed the process you go through to
right,
get
Vedhant,
to.
I mean, I think from our side, I think we're going to conclude on that, if you don't mind.
no, well, I think there was someone who was making a comment though.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Ludwig, you
Yes,
had
sorry, I
something.
got. Right, sorry, I got cut off there for a moment. Are there any further questions?
Yeah, so someone was speaking.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. I just have one question. How did you get your clients as a young architectural firm?
Sure. I think something that I didn't speak about at the beginning a lot was where I came from at WITS. And I had quite a successful thesis, which kind of won some awards and got international accreditation. And people Googled us and saw that we had kind of won these awards and things, and they came to us to do this work. But we also made a lot of our own work. So we've been quite involved in community upliftment programs where we made the work and we met people through there. And I suppose at the moment, a lot of it's spreading by word of mouth or someone who's read our research. But we also do quite a bit of heritage work. So we sit on the Joint Plans Committee, I sit on the Joint Plans Committee, which is kind of what did you call it? Like a heritage board, which looks at work. And the reason why we got the Country Club project was because we put in a really good proposal to them, but they were unsure of it. And when they brought the two proposals to the Heritage Committee, the Heritage Committee said, "Wait, this one is the one that you guys should go with because it's the one that responds best to the story of the old building." So sometimes it's luck. Sometimes it's by word of mouth. Sometimes it's through competition. At the moment, I'm just going to say we're very fortunate as a young firm to be getting the kind of work that we get.
Cool, thank you.
Then,
Vedhant,
yes.
so when you talked about the...
Sorry, what's your name?
Tanya.
Hi, Tanya.
Hi. I wanted to ask, when you talked about the Country Club project, and you mentioned that you had to appease to like 7,000 members or whatever. Obviously, the members aren't really your clients, but how do you deal with something like that where you have clients, but then you also have so much interaction with the people that are going to use the space and you feel like they can just voice their opinions left, right, and center?
Well, it's an interesting question because the club itself, in theory, is owned by all its members. So essentially, like they can't sell the club because the members own it, because people pay their like annual subscription fee, which also then makes them feel like they're entitled to their opinion all the time on anything really. We've seen in the club that it could be about what kind of napkins they put on the table or anything. So it's quite a difficult space to engage with because everybody with architecture also has an opinion. But what we did is we did a bit of member engagement where we presented to them and they were allowed to air their comments in an open forum. And we kind of very gingerly tiptoed around some of the questions that they asked because we knew that the building would work in a sense. But you have to be open to the engagement, and sometimes even the roughest engagement, like I've received sort of threatening emails from some people about it in the process, in the run-up to the construction, about how we could do something so ghastly and not country club-like. And they raised some valid points, which we took into account. And that's also where our approach to the final detailing came in, was to say, well, we've got to make it feel like it's old. So, in the process, I think you have to be quite open to listening to it, and just kind of accept that some people are not going to like things, and that everybody's voice, if you listen carefully, can be important to the process. That answers the question.
Yeah, thanks,
Yes,
Benedict.
Yeah, for me, it's not a question, but it's just something that I've taken from your lecture. I really understand, like, I really appreciate the process that you go through with, like, starting a project, like the design, like the small sketches, and how you even taste the way you're gonna make when you were talking about making the model one-to-one to understand how it's going to work. So I really enjoy that. And also, I'm friend with one of your employees, and I understand why you enjoy going to work so much. So yeah.
All right,
Cool.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, we've reached 11 o'clock, and I think we've come to the end of our third lecture. And again, a great thanks to you, Dante, for what I think is an inspirational session.
Thank you.
I also wanted to share for those, in terms of the CPD accreditation and points, I failed to mention it properly at the beginning, purely because of the sharing of the screen. The CPD link is available under www.ac.za/archplan/events/. You have to write that down properly, because for you to access that. And then the session phrase or password is ARPL4003 for those then that want to register their that they've been at the lecture itself. That registration is open until 12 o'clock. I'll leave the screen up as it is for people to just copy the text and make sure that they got the right contact links. And then again, as a last thank you again, Vedhant, for your input. And we are looking forward to our next session, which is Thursday at 10 o'clock. And it's going to be Henning Rasmus from Paragon, from the Paragon Group. And yes, and I hope all our guests will join us again. Thank you very much.